We'll start with Harrison Wallace, a player who was just playing in the playoffs a couple weeks ago here for Penn State as their top receiver, started all 15 games for them, and he lands at Ole Miss. Sergeant Morhew, good morning. Appreciate you joining us. But Harrison Wallace here, going to Ole Miss, it's not so much that it was a surprise that he landed at an Ole Miss. It's just like, man, they've added a lot now at that position. A lot of proven quality players at that spot at wide receiver. So loading up there, I just wonder, man, as you see their 5th receiver added by them via transfer portal, and then 3 more in recruiting. So you're overhauling that position completely. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, as we want to talk about this pickup in particular, but I wonder if there's going to be some post-spring movement there at Ole Miss.
Yeah, they actually added 4 in recruiting. Don't forget about Samari Reed, someone from down here in South Florida, a 3-star, but somebody with, to me, a lot of potential, someone I always liked, tough player, basketball player. But, diving into Harrison Wallace, big receiver, physically strong. That's what stands out about his game. 6'1", 198. He is from Pike Road, Alabama, so he's going back home somewhat to the Southeast, which a lot of people expected when he jumped into the portal. And it's interesting. You go from a team where the receivers did not catch the ball at all in that semifinal to a team like Ole Miss that fills the air with footballs. Now, there's 2 schools of thought. Some people might say, well, the reason the receivers didn't catch any passes is because the receivers weren't that good, right? Someone like Wallace, I'm sure he's thinking that the fact that the ball didn't go to him was a problem by everybody else, and now he's going to a system that's going to showcase his talents. As with all these things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but I do see some similarities to a Trey Harris. I'm not saying he's as good as Trey Harris with Wallace, but just the size and physicality and the ability to make big plays. I see that with them. You look at the stats, 46 catches for 720 yards, 15.7 yards per catch, which is a healthy number, 4 touchdowns in 15 games, 15 starts during this very long season for Penn State. In his career, 84 passes caught, 1,221 yards, 14.5 yards per catch. So again, definitely not a possession-only receiver. He makes some big plays, 6 touchdowns, 21 starts. You look at the teams in the mix, like I mentioned, most people thought he was going to go down south, visited Texas A&M, visited Ole Miss, visited Louisville, was going to go to South Carolina, canceled that visit when he committed to Ole Miss. So you're Ole Miss. You're losing Trey Harris to the draft. You're losing Jordan Watkins to the draft. You've added a ton. And Pete, just going through some of these names. You got Deuce Alexander from Wake Forest, younger player with a lot of promise, had 426 yards, over 400 yards as a freshman, now a rising sophomore. You look at Traylon Ray from West Virginia, someone from Tallahassee, Florida, familiar with from high school, 6'1", 195, 426 yards, 15 yards per catch, 4 touchdowns. He'll be a junior next year, so 2 young players. Caleb Odom, another guy who was a freshman at Alabama, more of a tight end wide receiver hybrid, super talented from Atlanta, Georgia, somebody that I think that will really grow and blossom here with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. You saw flashes of his talent as a freshman at Alabama. I think there's a lot more there. Really, the only question with him is how do you utilize him? He wants to play receiver. His body might tell you tight end. They got to figure that one out. And, of course, DeJon Stribling from Hawaii, was at Oklahoma State most recently. Another big physical receiver, not unlike Wallace, 6'2", 200 pounds, 882 yards last year, 17 yards per catch, big play receiver, 6 touchdowns. So that's just on the transfer market, Pete. But then you look at the high schoolers that are added. You mentioned Winston Watkins, 4-star, Dylan Alford, 4-star, Samari Reed, who we talked about earlier from down here in Broward County. But the name that I have circled, just like everybody else has circled, Caleb Cunningham, the 5-star. Last year, you saw what many people consider the best wide receiver class in a generation, right? With guys like, Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, Wingo, Wesco, Moore at Clemson. There's just a lot of very, very talented players. Coleman from Auburn, a lot of talented receivers, a depth of 5-star caliber receivers. This past class, I don't think has that kind of depth. But if you take the top 2, right, DeCorian Moore, who's going to Oregon, and Caleb Cunningham, I think you have 2 guys that are on par with those guys at the top and can have a huge, huge freshman year for their teams. Of course, Cunningham will have help from all those transfers we mentioned, and now Harrison Wallace coming from Penn State.
We saw Winston Watkins at a camp last year in South Florida, and I was a big fan of his game when we saw him as well.
Yeah, no, these guys are talented dudes, man. And again, Stripling and Wallace, I think those are your big physical receivers. But I like how the receiver class is layered. You have sort of your one and dones, which is going to be Wallace and Stripling. You have Ray, who's got a couple years left. Alexander, who's got 3 years left. And Odom also has 3 years left. And then, of course, the freshmen. So some of these guys are not going to last. We know how this goes. But you have layered talent in this wide receiver room. It's a system that is very friendly to wide receivers. Austin Simmons from down here in South Florida, lefty, somebody that we both love his upside and potential. He's going to have weapons and have every chance to succeed in this offense.